Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Naweed Jubarkil. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Jim Krane. Dr. Krane has spent nearly 20 years as a journalist, 6 of them in the Middle East. He was a long-time correspondent for the Associated Press based in Dubai, Baghdad, and New York, and has written for many publications, including the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. Jim got his PhD from the University of Cambridge in his 40s and made the switch to academia. He's been with Rice University since 2013. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Naweed. It's great to be here.
It's really exciting to speak to you. I think I started covering the region shortly after you did, and it's good to have that long-term perspective, I think, given how it's re-emerged, if you like, the Gulf in the global agenda at the moment, whether that's looking at energy and the clean energy transition or finance and all sorts of issues. What's dominating energy politics then, do you think, at the moment? Let's start with that. Is the possibility of disruption of supplies from the Middle East, given the geopolitical risk, of course, and Russia, a major concern for consumers and suppliers at the moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big mix of factors, right, as you point out. And the Gulf, of course, is right in the middle of it, as usual. I mean, here in the U.S., there's, interest in the Gulf countries in the GCC always seems to grow every year. So it's one of those places that's the center of attention at all sorts of, different important junctures. But yeah, big mix of factors on the the U.S. election. Obviously, I mean, here today in the U.S., people are voting. We've got all this warfare around the Middle East. With Israel and Iran, and others. And the Strait of Hormuz always comes up in those conversations. So Iran has said many times that if it's prevented from using the Strait of Hormuz, that it will prevent others, or at least do its best to try and prevent others from using the strait. And so that causes a lot of consternation around the world, including here in the U.S. We have a strategic petroleum reserve in the U.S., and we're basically self-sufficient in oil production, but our strategic petroleum reserve is only about half full right now. So, a closure of the strait wouldn't be a good thing for us, and obviously even worse for oil importing countries. So that weighs on folks' minds. We got another war in Russia and in the Ukraine. So Russia's invasion there has really done a number on oil markets and gas markets, especially in Europe, and really shifted the oil trade. Disrupted shipments from the Middle East going to Asia and rerouted a lot of those to Europe, and vice versa, right? So Russian oil that used to go to Europe is now going to the Middle East, where it has to get a free pass from the Houthi to go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal and out the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So, and we've got China, where the big demand story of a couple of decades ago now slowing drastically, and the weakness is evident in the oil price, and OPEC's kind of inability to bring any of its production that is cut back on stream, and then the energy transition, obviously a big story there, and the electric vehicle adoption in China much quicker than anticipated. So I saw a statistic recently that almost 50% of new vehicle purchases in China are now electric, so not using petroleum at all. And then climate change is always hanging over us. Climate disasters that seem to be getting worse every month. This giant the floods in Spain is going to probably focus some minds on the need for more government action on climate. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in oil markets around what governments might or might not do.
Yeah, and it's interesting, particularly if you consider the difference between the geopolitical events of the Middle East and Russia and the market's response to that. perhaps those demand side issues like the rise of electric vehicles, maybe some indication as to why the price reaction hasn't been as severe over the past year as it was in 2022. But looking at Middle Eastern fossil fuel suppliers, then, do you think, you mentioned climate change, are they taking climate change seriously enough, or are they just really confident that being the lower cost suppliers, that's going to ensure their market share for the foreseeable future? And if the West moves away, the Western world moves away from oil importation, then the developing world might fill that gap.
Yeah, I think both of those are true, right? So, the Middle East and the Gulf in particular, really have a kind of a lose-lose situation on climate. The folks in the Gulf are on the front lines of climate damage. I mean, the summers are getting hotter, and they're already hot. So, I mean, if things get much worse, it's going to be pretty tough to live there in the summer. Especially if the AC goes out, if the power goes off. We saw some pretty alarming, power cuts in Kuwait, in the middle of a heat wave, this summer. So it's, physical climate change is tough, but climate action that cuts down on fossil fuel demand is also tough on the economic side. So, obviously these governments get most of their budgets from oil exports or oil and gas exports. So, they haven't been, super eager to see a lot of action on that front because of the economics of it. So it's a really a tough quandary for that region in particular. Governments have been pretty slow to act on climate and on diversification, beyond oil until now. I think there's been a real burst of activity. But one of the recent papers that we've been working on here is to look at green energy, clean energy promises that Gulf countries made in the early 2000s. Where they set some goals that came due in 2020, and we look to see how well the 6 GCC states complied with their goals that they set, anywhere from 2006 to about 2012, and the answer is not very well. Only the UAE really alone complied with most of its goals. So the UAE did pretty well reaching its clean energy goals. The main setback for the UAE was that its nuclear plant, its 4-reactor nuclear plant in Baraka, was late. But its renewables goals came on stream almost in full and on time. So pretty good performance there. The other 5 GCC states, very weak performance. Below 20% of their goals in all of them, and in some cases much below 20% of their goals. So, however, there were some reasons behind some of those delays, and almost all of the countries, I think Kuwait and Bahrain are probably the laggards now, but the rest of them seem to be moving much more quickly now, and so we think there's going to be a better chance of success with their 2030 goals on renewables. The region has fantastic attributes for cutting carbon emissions. It's got, the net zero goals. Another thing I've taken a look at here. They have, the emissions in the GCC are often clustered in these small, industrial zones that happen to be right above subsurface storage. So good geological formations for storing carbon. Obviously, great solar resource there. Obviously, great engineering talent already in the oil and gas industry. That's also useful for storing carbon. And governments with often good access to funds, governance structures, autocratic governance. That is also useful in making long-term policy. And you mentioned that that the OPEC countries and that the Gulf countries would have an easier time in a declining market as oil demand declines. Yes, they are the low-cost suppliers, and that is going to help them in the future. but it may not help them so much with prices, right? So, I mean, I think that, all 6 Gulf governments need high prices to balance their government budgets, absent, more thorough, diversification. So they, they're going to have to try and hedge with something else, because a market that plateaus and starts to decline, you're probably looking at lower oil prices, depending on what OPEC does. So, more oil and gas and petrochemicals, cleaner fuels, hydrogen, ammonia. Those are probably the key hedges.
And we see that becoming more of a priority for all Gulf states at the moment, that diversification drive and the competition, if you like, that it's causing in the region. But let's look at, you said that governments are taking it more seriously or moving in the right direction. Subsidies are something that you've written extensively on, something that have been around for a long time. For those of us who remember being here in perhaps the 90s, the early 2000s, they were much, much higher, slowly coming down. Do you think that fossil fuel producing countries in the Gulf are still encouraging excessive consumption if you look at their per capita emissions, and how long before they seriously crack down on this, if they need to at all?
Yes. The answer is yes, still excessive consumption in the Gulf. And by the way, I don't want to single out the Gulf only. I mean, it's, the US, Australia, there's some, even China. Per capita emissions in China are higher than the EU average now. So, due to coal. So it's not, I don't want to single out the Gulf here, but yes, energy intensity is extraordinarily high in the GCC. For lots of reasons. A very hot climate. It's a very high income region. You've got energy intensive business sectors, including the LNG sector, and aluminums, petrochemicals, glass, et cetera, fertilizers, and you get the world's lowest energy prices, right there in that region, including Iran, and the only other country that's with energy prices anywhere near those in the Gulf is Venezuela, right? So really, Kuwait is kind of the poster child here. They've had power prices for the residential sector at 0.7 US cents, right? 2 Kuwaiti fils since 1966. So that's for 58 years. That price has not moved, has not budged. So it's basically, in real terms, it's gotten cheaper every year as inflation has reduced the price. And demand for power, at that sort of, at that low of a price, I mean, power consumption is kind of an afterthought. So people have built very large houses without great insulation in them or controls technology that use an extraordinary amount of power. And the Ministry of Electricity and Water in Kuwait, every additional kilowatt hour they sell, they lose more money. I mean, they have very little incentive to try and raise production, because power production, because it's so expensive for them, and their budget has been in arrears. So you've got blackouts now. You've got power cuts because demand is so high, and bills. When people pay their bills, sometimes the government doesn't even collect half of what it's owed, but that the bills only cover about 5% of the cost of providing that power. So. No reason, no incentive to put solar panels on the roof, because power is so cheap for the consumer, but not for the government. So it's really, pricing, energy prices in the GCC writ large are a really big factor of why those emissions are so high. And emissions are still going up. So, we just looked at, when these green goals were starting to be announced around 2006, was the first one in Abu Dhabi. Emissions have doubled in the Gulf since those clean power goals started to be promulgated. And if you look at an individual household in the Gulf, so we compared houses in Arizona, in the U.S. state of Arizona, which is pretty hot also, and also fairly wealthy. And we compared that with Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi's hotter and a bit wealthier. But by comparing those two, you're controlling for income and climate. And power demand per household in Abu Dhabi is 5 times that in Arizona. And a lot of that is due to the price, because the price is just a tiny fraction of what it is in Arizona. So yes, we've had some subsidy reforms. They've been partly successful. I think the Saudis are the furthest ahead on that. And you can see the result in their power demand for their, when they raised prices in 2016 and 2018 on household electricity. The demand did flatten out. We need a lot more reforms. This is an ideal time to do it in Kuwait because the parliament has been disbanded. So we're working on a paper that recommends a basic income program like the Saudi Citizens Account program to be put in effect in Kuwait. We'll see how that's received.
And let's go look at the geopolitical factors we touched on earlier. Just briefly, if you can, the Suez Canal. You mentioned the Houthis letting ships pass through there. Alleged attacks still continuing, impacting shipping. How is that impacting energy flows in real terms, do you think?
So on the attacking ship attacks in the Red Sea, so they have had an effect on energy flows. Not 100%. They haven't shut it down 100%, other than LNG, right? So LNG transiting the Red Sea, has halted, right? So I think since January there have been 0 LNG cargoes. I haven't heard of another one coming through recently. So that was true a few weeks ago. On oil, it's kind of Russian cargoes are getting through. They're basically coming in a southerly direction from the Black Sea, and Saudi oil is also going through. Actually, ironically, Saudi oil going through the Strait through the Suez Canal actually has increased because the Saudis have an export terminal on the Red Sea that they're using more than usual to get oil up through and into Europe. So the so-called friendly carriers, shipping firms or cargoes that from China or India, basically countries or companies that have no backing for Israel in its war in Gaza, are able to get through. The Houthi are letting them through, and then companies or firms or cargoes that have some sort of even very tentative or secondary links to Israel. They don't have to be traveling directly to Israel. Those are still being blocked and thwarted. So it's like a form of targeted economic sanctions. It's kind of a unique thing we're seeing in the Red Sea, and I'm not sure it's been examined enough from a sort of political science standpoint. Here you have a non-state actor that seems to be successfully imposing targeted economic sanctions on countries and firms that have some kind of affiliation or backing for Israel. So hopefully this all ends with the Gaza ceasefire, and then folks like us can pick it apart a little further.
And you've written recently about the potential of this sort of action to be replicated elsewhere around the world as well, particularly with what's happening in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea and the implications of that for shipping in the future, particularly around energy supplies. But let's talk about OPEC, if you will. Not a day, certainly not a week goes by when OPEC isn't in the news. As a collective organization, is it declining? Do you think we're seeing some rifts between major players? Reports of the Emiratis perhaps not wanting to play ball as much, or Saudi Arabia continuing to be the main price setter? Has that always been the case?
Yeah, I mean, Saudi, of course, is the world's biggest oil exporter, so it has the most market power, by dint of that fact. It also has spare capacity, and it's the Saudis have proven year after year that they are willing to make sacrifices in terms of big cuts to their own production. And they also have demonstrated that they are willing to engage in a price war, in flooding the market to enforce discipline in the cartel. So yes, I think it's fair to say that that it's always been the case that Saudi's the leader of OPEC, and is still the case. I think OPEC will be more important going forward as oil demand plateaus and declines. I mean, it remains to be seen how OPEC will handle, oil market in decline. I hope that it hangs together and distributes the market in a similar fashion to what it does now, maybe with a tweak that there's some favoritism given to countries with lower upstream carbon emissions. So if you can get your oil out of the ground in a more clean fashion, or sequester those emissions, or offset them somehow, and prove that and get that certified, one would hope that OPEC would take a look at that when they're setting quotas, and maybe give an advantage to that country. Here in the U.S., I mean, we saw that OPEC lost some market power to the shale production here in Texas, where I am, until the expansion in 2016, OPEC was looking like it was a weaker organization. But in 2016, Saudi Arabia and Russia began to make common cause, and we saw the OPEC plus expansion, and that restored some of the market power that had been lost to OPEC. And it also changed the fabric of OPEC a bit. I mean, it seems to be now a bit less friendly to U.S. interests, at least overtly. I mean, I think Saudi and the U.S. and the Biden administration and the Saudi authorities seem to be making common cause again, but not in the early part of the Biden administration, they were definitely at loggerheads. But Saudi Arabia is not this. Saudi Arabia has also become more price hawkish, and has been pushing for higher oil prices pretty consistently for the past few years, and that seems to be backfiring right now. It's attracted a lot of non-OPEC supply, the higher oil prices, and we're seeing production increases here in the U.S., kind of gradually growing shale production. Places like Brazil, Guyana, Canada, Norway a bit, and so we're seeing more non-OPEC oil coming on the market. That seems to be one of the factors that's pushing prices down right now, potentially setting the stage for another price war, the next price war. When is Saudi Arabia going to have to act and try and reestablish discipline in the cartel and discourage non-OPEC investment? So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I want to finish off talking about the US, given its role now as the largest producer in the world when it comes to oil, and its rising gas. But looking at countries shifting away from the dirtier fuels, if you like, coal. You touched on transition fuels earlier. Do you think that countries like Qatar have a unique role to play in driving forward that transition, the role it will play, particularly if you consider emerging markets, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and their need to continue powering their economies? And is it climate change that's driving that move from coal to gas, do you think?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of coal to gas switching for a whole bunch of reasons, all of them really good, right? So, gas has been pretty cheap lately, especially here in the U.S., right? So that's been pushing coal out here. Elsewhere in the world, gas prices are a bit more volatile, and especially if you're importing LNG, you might not see coal getting pushed out for economic reasons, or at least not as much as we've seen here in the United States. I mean, we're seeing double-digit coal consumption drops every year. But it's not just gas pushing coal out of the power generation stack. I mean, it's also renewables, which is are also cheaper than burning coal in most places, right? So there's a misconception out there that coal is the cheapest way to make power, and it certainly is not. It might be one of the ways to make a cheaper baseload power, but not just power writ large. But yeah, climate is, of course, a factor in this. I mean, coal is obviously the most CO2 per unit of energy, about double that of a gas power plant, per unit of energy delivered. But that's, one of another another key factor is local pollution. I mean, the cities that have the worst air quality are all in coal-fired countries that use a lot of coal in their power sectors. So mostly in India and in China, right? And this is really, because they burn so much coal, it causes lots of local pollution there that are horrible for life expectancy. You're seeing, life expectancy should be increasing more than it is in some of these countries. And I think there's going to be a realization that, you can't be a quote unquote developed country and still burn a lot of coal, because it's going to show up in your public health figures. You're still going to have, you're still going to be lagging the developed world in public health. So it's looking like hopefully coal is only a bootstrapping fuel in the future, and hopefully being replaced by cleaner fuels, gas in the short term, nuclear and renewables in the longer term.
In the United States, let's finish by talking about that. Jim, where you're based now, of course, the largest producer of oil and gas, really transforming not just the US market, considering OPEC, the whole global energy market over the past decade or so. What's driving US energy policy today, do you think?
So US energy policy, it's kind of interesting. The US has a Department of Energy, and its main job is nuclear weapons, right? It keeps track of our nuclear weapons and governs that. We don't have a written energy policy. The government does not. There's no sort of written energy policy that the federal government follows. It's really markets that govern energy policy in the U.S. And not the federal government. So I describe the federal government as like a third-tier player in the U.S. after the market, and then state governments, individual states in the U.S. actually get involved in energy policy more than the federal government. So, we know, we've seen it many times, the U.S. president likes to take credit when U.S. gasoline prices are low, and then, of course, tries to shed the blame when prices are high. Neither of those is really accurate. U.S. president really has two options when it comes to gasoline prices, which are usually important at election time. I mean, right now, this election season, gas prices are low, so nobody is bothered by it. But when they're high, it's a big issue. But the U.S. president really only has two options, right? He can get on the phone and ask Saudi Arabia for some more, to open the taps and raise production. Or if that doesn't work, he can tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as Biden was forced to do, a few years ago. Other than that, the federal government doesn't have much that it can do in the short run. Longer term, it can crank up regulations on vehicle fuel efficiency, or maybe support more electric vehicles. But U.S. oil companies, are not national oil companies that take orders from their governments. I mean, they don't listen to OPEC. They don't listen to the U.S. president. I mean, we here in Houston have a big energy conference every year called Zero Week. A couple of years ago, we had U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm was one of the speakers there. She asked the entire audience to please raise oil production because gasoline prices were high. And none of the oil company executives in the conference seemed to be paying attention to her or inspired to take action, because they take their orders from the market and they make individual decisions based on what the market's telling them. So, not a really big role here in the U.S. for the federal government in energy policy.
And many would argue it was the market that drove the rise of shale production and helped transform America's rise, at least self-sufficiency, from a self-sufficiency perspective in terms of energy supplies. But it has been a political issue. Obviously, election season, as you touched upon, both candidates, whether that's renewables and tariffs there, or looking at fracking and Kamala Harris's opinions on previous statements on fracking, it has become a political issue this time around. Looking at the election, will it have made any major effect, do you think, on the US as an energy industry moving forward? And there is currently a hold, of course, on the development of gas exporting terminals in the US. Will that hold still be in place, do you think, for much longer?
I mean, I think the hold will probably be lifted after the election, either way. I don't think there's going to be a huge effect on U.S. energy policy. Whoever's elected. I guess the thing I might look for are sort of secondary effects from U.S. foreign policy, depending on who's elected. So, if sanctions are cranked up against Iran again, and then we have more sanctions enforcement, we could see about 1 million barrels a day taken off of oil markets if Iran's exports are bottled up again. So that would cause the oil price to go up. So U.S. motorists wouldn't like that, but U.S. oil companies would like that. So, neither candidate is going to have a big effect on U.S. oil production. Again, the companies here are, free to invest when they like, or free to withhold investment when they like, and they basically take their signals from the market. So, I don't see a big difference in domestic energy policy. Maybe fewer subsidies for renewables, longer term. If Republicans dominate the three branches of government, but potentially not much else.
And it'll be interesting to see how the new president manages to deal with that pressure from states as well, particularly given the fervent support that many have given to the Inflation Reduction Act, even when traditionally they wouldn't have been seen as supporting that when it comes to the impact it has on job creation, for example. So it will be watched closely. But Jim, thank you. That concludes the podcast and the interview today. On behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation, just wanted to thank you again for joining us today and providing our listeners with your valuable insights on the energy industry, your background in journalism, and of course, what's happening in the world's largest energy producer at the moment. The foundation looks forward to continuing this conversation with you soon.
Well, thanks. Always happy to chat with you all. So I appreciate you having me on.
Look forward to catching up in person soon, hopefully. And thank you, of course, for listening as well. A new Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast will be released in the coming weeks, so be sure to check out our website and social media pages.